This story might change how you see people forever. A maid nobody noticed. A fiancée who thought she owned the room. And one kick that changed everything in front of 300 witnesses. Nobody in that ballroom knew who they were really looking at. Nobody knew her real name. Nobody knew what she used to do before she picked up a mop instead of a weapon. But that night, under a chandelier worth more than most people's homes, the truth came out in the most unexpected way possible. And by the time it was over, nobody in that room would ever look at a maid the same way again. Hey, welcome back to the channel. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and which country you belong to. Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Today's story is one of the most emotional and satisfying ones I've ever shared with you. It's about pride, about being underestimated, and about a secret so well hidden that even the people closest to her never suspected a thing. Stay until the end because what happens in that ballroom will stay with you for a long time. She had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous person in the room is usually the one nobody bothers to look at. Her name was Naomi Reyes, 29 years old, and for the past year she had worked as a maid in the Whitmore estate, a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of Boston that belonged to one of the wealthiest families in New England. She wore a pink and white uniform every day, kept her hair tied back in a tight bun, and moved through the halls of that mansion so quietly that most days she was invisible. That was exactly how she liked it. Naomi had a past most people would never guess just by looking at her. Before she wore an apron, she wore a different kind of uniform. Before she learned how to fold linens with military precision, she learned how to break a man's grip in under 2 seconds. She had spent 8 years of her life training in a discipline that most people only saw in movies. The kind of training that teaches you to be calm when everyone else is panicking, to be silent when everyone else is screaming, and to be still right up until the moment you're not. But nobody at the Whitmore estate knew any of that. To them she was just Naomi. Quiet maid. The one who never talked back, never complained, and always had the coffee ready by 6 in the morning. The man of the house was Ethan Whitmore, 33 years old, heir to a real estate empire his father had built from nothing. Ethan wasn't like the other wealthy men Naomi had worked for in the past. He was polite. He remembered her name. He said thank you, even when he didn't have to. Sometimes, late at night when the house was empty except for the two of them, he'd wander into the kitchen and talk to her. About his father, about the pressure of running a company he never asked to inherit, about how lonely it felt to be surrounded by people who only wanted something from him. Naomi never asked him questions. She just listened. And somewhere along the way, without either of them planning it, those quiet late-night conversations became the realest thing in Ethan's entire life. But Ethan was engaged. His fiancée's name was Vanessa Sterling, 31 years old, a woman who had grown up in a world of country clubs and private jets, a world where staff existed to be seen and not heard. Vanessa was beautiful in the way magazine covers are beautiful. Polished, sharp-edged, and cold underneath the surface if you looked closely enough. From the very first day Naomi started working at the estate, Vanessa had made it clear, without ever saying it directly, that she considered the staff beneath her. She'd snap her fingers instead of saying, "Excuse me." She'd leave messes on purpose just to watch someone else clean them up. She'd talk about the staff like they weren't standing 3 feet away. Naomi endured it. Not because she was weak, anything but because she had promised herself after everything that happened in her old life, that she would never again use her hands unless she absolutely had to. She had walked away from a violent world to build a peaceful one. And a peaceful life meant swallowing her pride sometimes, even when a woman like Vanessa Sterling looked straight through her like she didn't exist. What Naomi didn't know was that Vanessa had started to notice something else entirely. The way Ethan's eyes softened whenever Naomi walked into a room. The way he laughed a little easier around her. The way he seemed to breathe differently in the kitchen at midnight than he did in the boardroom at noon. And Vanessa Sterling was not a woman who liked to share attention. Especially not with the help. The engagement party was set to take place in 3 weeks, in the grand ballroom of the estate, the same ballroom where Ethan's parents had gotten married 35 years earlier. 300 guests, senators, CEOs, old money and new money, all in one glittering room. Vanessa had been planning it for months, obsessing over every detail, determined to make it the event of the year. She had no idea that the biggest moment of that night wouldn't be planned by her at all. 2 weeks before the party, Naomi was polishing silverware in the dining room when she overheard Vanessa on the phone with a friend. "Honestly, I don't even know why Ethan keeps her around," Vanessa was saying, her voice dripping with the kind of casual cruelty people use when they think no one important is listening. "She's just staff. If she ever stepped out of line, I'd have her fired in 5 minutes. People like that don't belong in rooms like ours." Naomi didn't flinch. She kept polishing the same fork, slow and steady, her face calm as still water. But somewhere deep inside her, a part of herself she'd buried a long time ago quietly stirred awake. She thought about her old instructor, a woman who had trained her from the age of 16, who used to say, "The loudest person in the room is rarely the most dangerous one. Real power doesn't need to announce itself." Naomi finished polishing the fork, set it down gently, and walked out of the room without a word. But something had shifted. And though she didn't know it yet, fate was already setting the stage for a night that would change everything. Not just for her, but for everyone standing in that ballroom when the chandeliers were lit and the music was playing and Vanessa Sterling made the biggest mistake of her life. Because in 3 weeks, Vanessa was going to find out exactly who she had been underestimating. And she was going to find out in front of everyone. Some secrets don't stay buried forever, especially when pride refuses to let them rest. The days leading up to the engagement party moved quickly. The estate buzzed with florists, caterers, and event planners rushing in and out, transforming the ballroom into something out of a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers were polished until they threw rainbows across the marble floor. Gold trim was touched up along every archway. Vanessa walked through it all like a queen inspecting her kingdom, snapping orders, dismissing suggestions, making sure every single detail reflected the image she wanted the world to see. Naomi worked longer hours during those 2 weeks, helping prepare the house for the influx of guests. She didn't complain. She never did. But something had changed in the way she carried herself. A quiet steadiness that hadn't been there before, like a woman who had made peace with a decision she hadn't spoken aloud yet. Ethan noticed it. He always noticed things about Naomi that other people missed. "You've been different lately," he said one evening, finding her in the kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed. The house was dark except for the small light above the stove. "Everything okay?" Naomi looked up from the cup of tea she was making. "Just thinking about some things from my past," she said honestly. "Old habits, old promises, good or bad." She smiled faintly. "Both, I think. Most important things usually are." Ethan wanted to ask more, but something in her expression told him not to push. Instead, he sat down across from her the way he always did, and for a few minutes, they just existed together in the quiet. Two people from completely different worlds who somehow understood each other better than anyone else in their lives. "Vanessa doesn't know how lucky she is to marry into a family that still has people like you looking after it," Naomi said softly, almost to herself. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "Sometimes I wonder if she sees any of it the way I do." Naomi didn't respond. It wasn't her place to say what she was really thinking. Meanwhile, Vanessa's suspicion had been growing like a slow-burning fire. She began finding small reasons to test Naomi, asking her to redo tasks that were already done perfectly, criticizing things that didn't need criticizing, watching her carefully whenever Ethan was in the room. She couldn't explain why this particular maid unsettled her so much. It wasn't jealousy exactly. It was something else. A strange, nagging feeling that Naomi wasn't quite what she appeared to be. One afternoon, while going through old renovation records in the estate's private office, Vanessa found something odd. A background check file, buried in an old folder Ethan's father had kept from years ago, listed Naomi's previous employment history. Most of it was standard, references, cleaning companies, a few private households. But one line caught Vanessa's eye. A 3-year gap in employment history, right after Naomi turned 20. No explanation. No records. Just silence. Vanessa didn't think much of it at the time. She simply filed it away in her mind as one more reason not to trust her. She had no idea that those 3 missing years held the truth of who Naomi Reyes really was. During that time, Naomi had trained under a master combat instructor in a private academy that didn't exist on paper, learning a fighting discipline reserved for a very small, very serious group of students, the kind of training meant for protection work, close-quarters defense, situations where hesitation meant death. She had been good. Better than good. Her instructor once told her she had hands faster than most people's thoughts. But after an incident Naomi rarely allowed herself to think about, a violent night that ended with her walking away from that life entirely, she made a vow to herself. No more fighting. No more violence. She wanted a quiet life, a peaceful life, the kind most people take for granted. Becoming a maid wasn't a step down for her. It was a choice. A deliberate, peaceful rebellion against a world that had once demanded too much of her hands and not enough of her heart. But peace, she was about to learn, doesn't always last forever, especially when someone else decides to test it. The night before the party, Vanessa cornered Naomi in the hallway outside the ballroom. The tension between them had been building for weeks, and it finally spilled over. "I don't know what game you're playing with my fiancé," Vanessa said, her voice low and sharp. "But tomorrow night, in front of everyone, you're going to remember your place." Naomi met her eyes calmly. "I've never forgotten it, Miss Sterling." "We'll see about that," Vanessa said before turning and walking away, heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown clock. Naomi stood alone in the hallway for a long moment, staring at the chandeliers being hung above the ballroom floor, glittering like stars waiting to fall. Tomorrow night, 300 guests would fill that room. Tomorrow night, Vanessa Sterling would try to humiliate her in front of everyone who mattered. And tomorrow night, without meaning to, Vanessa was going to find out exactly who she had spent the last year underestimating. Because some people don't raise their voice when they're threatened. They simply wait. Nobody in that ballroom expected the night to end with a woman flying through the air. The engagement party was everything Vanessa had dreamed of. The ballroom glittered under 1,000 tiny lights, string quartets played softly in the corner, and champagne flowed like the night itself was made of gold. 300 guests filled the space. Business partners, socialites, distant relatives, and a handful of reporters covering the biggest social event of the Boston season. Naomi worked quietly among the catering staff, carrying trays, refilling glasses, staying invisible the way she always did. She had promised herself she would get through the night calmly, professionally, without giving Vanessa the satisfaction of a single reaction. She almost made it. Around 9 p.m., as the toasts began and Ethan stood at the front of the room with a champagne glass in hand, Vanessa spotted Naomi crossing near the edge of the dance floor with a tray of drinks. Something in her snapped. Maybe it was the champagne. Maybe it was the way Ethan's eyes had drifted toward Naomi just seconds earlier during his toast, softening in that familiar way Vanessa had grown to hate. Maybe it was simply months of resentment finally boiling over in front of the one audience Vanessa cared about most, everyone she wanted to impress. Whatever the reason, Vanessa marched across the ballroom floor, heels clicking sharply against the marble, and grabbed the tray out of Naomi's hands, sending glasses crashing to the ground in front of hundreds of stunned guests. The music stopped. The room went silent. "You know what?" Vanessa said loudly, her voice carrying across the ballroom. "I'm done pretending you're just staff. Everyone's noticed the way you look at my fiancé. The way he looks at you. So let's settle this right now, in front of everyone. Since apparently you think you belong in this world. Naomi stood perfectly still. Her expression calm despite the crowd of eyes now locked onto her. Miss Sterling, I think we should discuss this privately. No, Vanessa snapped. I want everyone to see exactly what you are. And then, without warning, Vanessa shoved her. Hard, both hands against Naomi's shoulders, the kind of shove meant to humiliate, to send a maid stumbling backward in front of the wealthiest crowd in Boston. What Vanessa didn't expect was that Naomi didn't stumble at all. She simply shifted her weight, absorbing the push effortlessly. Her feet rooted like she'd been standing on that exact spot her whole life. A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. Vanessa, embarrassed and now furious that her dramatic moment hadn't landed the way she wanted, swung again, this time an open-handed slap aimed directly at Naomi's face. It never landed. In the space of half a second, something in Naomi shifted. 8 years of buried training rising to the surface in one smooth, controlled motion. She caught Vanessa's wrist mid-air, redirected the momentum, and in one fluid movement that looked almost like choreography, sent Vanessa off balance and airborne. Her designer heels leaving the marble floor entirely as gasps erupted around the ballroom. Time seemed to freeze. 300 guests watched in stunned silence as Vanessa Sterling, heiress, socialite, bride-to-be, hung suspended in the air for one impossible second before landing safely. Controlled, not harmed, but utterly humiliated. On the dance floor in front of everyone she had ever wanted to impress. Naomi stood over her, breathing steady, expression unreadable, the pink and white uniform she wore looking almost absurd next to the level of skill she had just displayed. Ethan stood frozen near the front of the room, champagne glass still in his hand, staring at Naomi like he was seeing her, truly seeing her, for the very first time. Vanessa scrambled to her feet, mascara streaked, dress twisted, humiliation burning across her face. What are you?" she stammered, staring at Naomi like she was looking at a stranger. The entire ballroom waited, breathless, for the answer. Naomi looked around at the sea of stunned faces, at the chandeliers glittering above her, at Ethan's shocked expression, and finally back at Vanessa, still sprawled on the floor in front of everyone. "My name is Naomi Reyes," she said quietly, her voice steady enough to carry across the silent room. "Before I was a maid, I spent 8 years training in close combat defense under one of the most respected instructors in the country. I walked away from that life because I wanted peace, not power. I never wanted anyone to know. I never wanted this." She paused, looking directly at Vanessa. "But I will not be humiliated in front of hundreds of people simply because someone decided I didn't matter enough to be treated with basic respect." The silence that followed felt like it lasted a lifetime. And somewhere in that silence, 300 wealthy, powerful people who had spent their entire lives looking past people like Naomi Reyes finally understood something they would never forget. You never truly know who someone is just by the uniform they wear. What happened next in that ballroom would be talked about for years, not because of what Naomi did, but because of what she chose to do afterward. For a long moment nobody moved. Vanessa remained on the floor, humiliated in front of the very people she had spent months trying to impress. Reporters near the back of the room exchanged wide-eyed glances, already sensing the story they'd be writing tomorrow. Ethan finally set down his champagne glass and crossed the ballroom floor, stepping past his stunned fiancée without a word, and knelt beside Naomi instead. Not out of concern for a fight, but out of something that looked, to everyone watching, remarkably like awe. "Naomi," he said quietly, "why didn't you ever tell me?" Naomi's eyes softened, the hardness of the last few seconds melting away into something far more vulnerable. "Because the moment people find out what you're capable of, they stop seeing who you actually are. I wanted to be seen as a person first, not a weapon." Behind them, Vanessa finally pulled herself up off the floor, adjusting her twisted dress with trembling hands, humiliation quickly curdling into anger. "This is unbelievable," she spat, pointing a shaking finger at Naomi. "She just assaulted me. Someone call security. Have her arrested." But something remarkable happened next. Something nobody in that ballroom, least of all Vanessa, expected. An elderly man near the front of the crowd stepped forward. It was Harold Whitmore, Ethan's grandfather, 91 years old, a man who had built the family's fortune from nothing and rarely spoke publicly anymore. His voice, though frail, carried a weight that silenced the room instantly. "I saw the whole thing," Harold said, leaning on his cane, eyes sharp despite his age. "This young woman didn't attack anyone. She defended herself against an assault, with remarkable restraint, in front of 300 witnesses. If anyone should be worried about consequences tonight, Miss Sterling, it isn't her." Vanessa's face went pale. Harold turned to Naomi, studying her with newfound respect. "Young lady, in all my years, I've never seen control like that. You could have hurt her badly. You chose not to. That tells me more about your character than any resume ever could." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Several guests who had witnessed Vanessa's cruelty toward staff over the months, small comments here, dismissive gestures there, began nodding, exchanging knowing glances. The mask Vanessa had worn so carefully for years had finally slipped, and everyone in that ballroom had seen exactly what was underneath. Ethan stood up slowly, turning to face Vanessa directly. His expression a mixture of disappointment and clarity, like a fog had finally lifted from his eyes. "I think," he said quietly, "we need to talk. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Right now." "Ethan, you can't be serious," Vanessa said, her voice cracking with disbelief. "You're choosing the maid over me. In front of everyone." "I'm not choosing anyone," Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "I'm finally seeing clearly. I've spent the last year falling for someone's kindness, someone's patience, someone's strength, and I was too afraid to admit it, even to myself, because it felt complicated. But you just showed everyone in this room exactly who you are, Vanessa. And it's not someone I recognize anymore." The ballroom remained utterly silent, 300 guests witnessing something far more real than any engagement party they had ever attended. A truth unfolding in real time, raw and unscripted, in front of the most powerful people in Boston. Vanessa looked around at the crowd, searching for support, for sympathy, for anyone who might come to her defense. She found none. Instead, she found dozens of faces that had quietly disapproved of her for a long time, finally feeling free to show it. Without another word, Vanessa turned and stormed out of the ballroom, her dress trailing behind her, heels echoing against the marble floor until the heavy doors slammed shut behind her. The silence that followed felt different this time. Not shocked, but strangely peaceful, like the entire room had been holding its breath for months and had finally been allowed to exhale. Ethan turned back to Naomi, who stood quietly amid the wreckage of shattered champagne glasses and scattered rose petals, looking suddenly very human despite everything the room had just witnessed. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said softly. Naomi shook her head gently. "I'm not sorry it happened. I'm sorry it took this long for the truth to come out." Around them, something unexpected began happening. One by one, members of the household staff who had been standing quietly along the walls throughout the entire event began to step forward. A groundskeeper, a chef, 2 other maids who had worked alongside Naomi for months. They surrounded her, not out of pity, but out of quiet solidarity, the kind that only forms between people who understand what it feels like to be overlooked. Harold Whitmore raised his glass slowly, his aged voice carrying across the room one final time. "To Naomi Reyes," he said, A woman who reminded all of us tonight that true strength isn't about how loudly you demand respect. It's about how gracefully you earn it, even when the world refuses to give it to you first. Glasses rose across the ballroom. Even the string quartet, still frozen near the corner, lowered their instruments in quiet respect. Nobody in that room would ever forget what happened that night. But the most important part of Naomi's story hadn't happened yet. Sometimes the most powerful ending isn't about revenge. It's about what you choose to build after everything falls apart. In the weeks following the engagement party, the story of what happened in the Whitmore ballroom spread quickly, not through gossip magazines or scandal blogs, but through the quiet, genuine respect of everyone who had witnessed it firsthand. Vanessa Sterling's engagement to Ethan Whitmore was formally called off within days. Announced quietly, without drama, without blame placed publicly on anyone. Vanessa herself eventually left Boston altogether, moving to New York to start over, away from the whispers that followed her wherever she went. Naomi expected to be fired. In her experience, when the wealthy world's carefully constructed order gets disrupted, it's rarely the powerful who pay the price. But Ethan surprised her once again. "You're not going anywhere," he told her simply, a few days after the party, finding her in the kitchen the way he always did. "Unless you want to." This house has never felt more honest than it did that night. Over the following months, something quietly beautiful began to unfold. Ethan and Naomi's friendship, built patiently over a year of late-night conversations and quiet understanding, slowly grew into something neither of them had expected but both had secretly hoped for. There was no rush, no dramatic declaration. Just two people who had finally stopped pretending they didn't see each other clearly. But the most meaningful change wasn't about romance at all. Naomi used her sudden, unexpected visibility for something far more important than her own story. She reached out to a local community center in Boston that worked with young girls from difficult backgrounds. Girls who had grown up feeling invisible, unheard, underestimated, much like she once had before she found her own strength. With Ethan's support, she started a self-defense and confidence-building program, teaching these girls not just how to protect themselves physically, but how to carry themselves with quiet, unshakable dignity in a world that too often tried to make them feel small. "You don't need to be loud to be strong," she told her first class of 12 girls, their eyes wide with attention. "You don't need anyone's permission to matter. Real strength is knowing exactly who you are, even when the whole world tries to convince you otherwise." One of the girls, a shy 13-year-old named Camila, stayed after class one evening and asked quietly, "Were you scared?" That night, in front of everyone. Naomi thought about it honestly before answering. "I wasn't scared of what she could do to me. I was scared of what would happen if I stayed silent one more time." Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't fighting back. It's finally refusing to shrink yourself for someone else's comfort. Camila nodded slowly, something shifting behind her eyes. The same quiet spark Naomi remembered feeling herself many years ago, before life taught her how powerful that spark could become. A year later, the Whitmore Ballroom hosted another event. Quieter this time, smaller, more intimate. Ethan and Naomi's wedding. There were no glittering 300-guest spectacles, no performative displays of wealth. Just close friends, family, household staff who had become like family, and 12 young girls from Naomi's program sitting proudly in the front row, watching the woman who had taught them what real strength looked like. Harold Whitmore, now 92, stood to give a toast. His voice frail but full of warmth. "I've watched this family build empires," he said, smiling at Naomi and Ethan standing together. "But I've never watched anyone build something as valuable as what this woman built tonight. A room full of people who finally understand that dignity was never about the uniform you wear. It was about the heart underneath it." The room erupted in applause, glasses raised high, The same chandeliers that had witnessed humiliation a year earlier now glowing warmly over something entirely different. Healing, growth, and quiet, well-earned joy. And somewhere in that crowd, Naomi looked around at everything her life had become, not because she fought her way there, but because she finally allowed herself to be seen exactly as she was. Here's the truth this story leaves us with. Never assume you know someone's whole story just by the role they hold in your life. The quietest person in the room might carry the deepest strength you've ever witnessed. Respect isn't something you owe only to the powerful. It's something every single person deserves, simply for being human. If this story touched your heart tonight, if it reminded you that kindness and quiet strength always outlast cruelty in the end, then please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one again, and share it with someone in your life who needs to hear tonight that they matter exactly as they are. Thank you for watching. And remember, the world is full of quiet namas. Treat everyone with the respect they deserve, because you never truly know the strength someone is carrying underneath the surface.